Right. So again, let me start. So welcome again, obviously, to this webinar this morning to cover asbestos management in the UK. I have a presentation to run through that will take around about 35 minutes. And then at the end, I'm happy to answer questions. If you can keep all your questions towards the end, and then I'll answer those as and when at the end. And by all means, put questions in the chat as you go through if things come to mind, and I'll review those later. Now, I've worked in the asbestos consultancy industry for over 20 years now. And when I started in my role as an asbestos surveyor and then working in the lab and doing asbestos air monitoring, did I think we'd be here in 2023 still talking about asbestos and asking the question, are we doing enough? So this morning, I want to cover off some recent reports that have been issued last year and the implications that may have for asbestos management going forward for the next 20, 30 years. So like I say, in terms of the presentation, I'll run through that now. If you can keep your microphones off, that should prevent any background noise. Like I say, I'm happy to answer questions at the end. So really, I want to cover off the following things. So a brief overview of what I'm going to look at. I'm going to touch on legislation very, very quickly. I've made the assumption that most of you will have a base understanding of asbestos and asbestos management. So we just want to cover off the basics there. I then want to provide you some updated information on asbestos-related illness in the UK and the HSE figures for mesothelioma deaths. Now, obviously, mesothelioma is a cancer caused by asbestos exposure. Again, it's very relevant. And I'm going to touch on the kind of current size of where the asbestos issue is in the UK in terms of asbestos in buildings. And then we're going to roll it into some recent reports that were issued associated with the government inquiry into the HSE's management of asbestos in the UK, followed by ATAC, or the Asbestos Testing and Consultancy Trade Body, and their response to what that government inquiry found. And then finally, the PIR, the Post-Implementation Review, undertaken of the asbestos regulations that was issued end of last year. And then I'm going to cover off some of the incidents and issues around asbestos management in the UK and wrap up with a very brief summary. Let's start off with legislation. Now, you will know that asbestos is a hazardous material and therefore it's heavily regulated in the UK. We have our own set of asbestos regulations. They've been in place since 2012. But in fact, asbestos regulations and legislation has been around for many, many decades. You can go back to the 1930s Factories Act, where asbestos is mentioned. So therefore, asbestos is deemed to be a hazardous material, and therefore it needs proper regulation and management. And to do that, the HSE works to the control of asbestos regulations, and those sets of regulations are designed to protect people in buildings in terms of reducing exposure to asbestos, and also in terms of contractors who remove asbestos, in terms of the methods they must use to minimise their risk. But I suppose three key regulations in the asbestos regulations 2012 that are aimed at purely managing asbestos risk for individuals within buildings are regulation for the duty to manage, and that came into place in 2002. And that is primarily there to assess buildings and to enable what's called the duty holder to have the ability to produce a management plan to manage asbestos risk within the building once that material has been identified through surveys. So there's a duty to manage that risk. That's day to day, week to week, year on year. Then should there be any need to refurbish buildings, upgrade buildings, or demolish buildings, Regulation 5 applies in terms of the requirement to identify asbestos prior to major works. And again, this is all about finding those hidden asbestos materials. So typically this is an intrusive survey to identify those hidden materials that contain asbestos within the building structure that could be disturbed and therefore release asbestos and pose a risk to workers who are doing those works. Regulation 5 very key in terms of reducing fibre exposure. And then finally, Regulation 10, it's all about training and making contractors, people who work on buildings, aware of asbestos risks. And through that training, being able to stop work if they suspect there to be asbestos materials, and thereby reduce the risk of disturbing asbestos by drilling that material and producing a fibre release. So that's asbestos regulations in a very kind of quick nutshell. You know, they're there, they're in place, and really we've got to ask ourselves, are these regulations effective? That's what we're going to kind of try and discuss throughout this presentation. So I mentioned that obviously exposure to asbestos causes mesothelioma. And mesothelioma is a condition of the lung. It's a lung cancer only caused by asbestos exposure. The HSE issue and publish figures every year on asbestos mesothelioma death rates. The figures published last year for the year ending 2020, and they issued an increase, or showed an increase to 2,544, so an increase on 2019. Now the HSE have obviously logged and plotted the deaths from mesothelioma for many decades now, and the little graph here shows the increase on the blue line of mesothelioma deaths going up to around about 2012, 2015 to the peak, and then sort of plateauing. And also the light blue line here is our claims for industrial injuries benefit claims, again showing a similar increase and peak. Now this increase kind of reflects the increase in use of asbestos or exposure to asbestos during the 1950s and 60s into the 70s, and then a time lapse of around about 30, 40, 50 years before asbestos disease takes hold. This kind of mirrors the peak of exposure to asbestos 40, 50 years ago. Now, the HSE predicts that through their modelling that the death rates will thankfully reduce in the coming years and decades. And you can see here the purpley lines are starting to show that reduction. So that in 2030, there could be between 1.5 and 2,000 annual deaths from mesothelioma. And the point to note here is that there's been no real reduction over the past 8 years. There's kind of a plateau here. Hopefully, we now are at the kind of the highest figures we're likely to see, around about 2,500 a year. And this uptick here in 2020, with an increase for both males and females, is thought to be potentially be a result of COVID. So the COVID pandemic in 2020 would have unfortunately meant that some people with mesothelioma may have died earlier with COVID as well. So these figures may be slightly worse than perhaps they would have been if there was no COVID. So we have these figures issued every year, and I think what's quite startling really is that mesothelioma is no longer considered to be a disease of men. Now, historically, asbestos exposure happened in heavy industry where asbestos was used to lag pipes, like boilers. It was used as insulation, as fire retardant material in ceiling tiles. A lot of that material was handled and manufactured and installed by men, and that's where most of the exposure happened. However, these figures from 2020 show that 459 females died of mesothelioma in the UK. So nearly 20% of mesothelioma deaths in the UK are currently of females. And we need to ask our question, where did that exposure happen? Certainly wouldn't have been in the 1960s, 1970s. Women would not have been installing that material. They would have not have been working on building sites. So clearly their exposure potentially happened either in the workplace or from getting exposed by perhaps cleaning their partner's clothes that was contaminated with asbestos. So clearly there's a risk here to asbestos at lower levels compared to the kind of the normal understanding of asbestos being a condition, mesothelioma being a condition of heavy exposure to asbestos. And the HSE do acknowledge that their modelling is not reliable for long-term predictions. This is really their kind of best case kind of scenarios here. It assumes that asbestos is being managed adequately and that exposures are minimal and are being reduced. So in terms of mesothelioma then, in the UK, the media perception of asbestos is that it's not a good news story. So in generally, it's not covered. Although I will say that there was a very good article written in the Sunday Times this weekend on asbestos risk. You know, this is probably the first time it's had a a multiple page covered in a major newspaper for many for a long time. You tend to get greater coverage for likes of fire risk and mold, in the media at present. And clearly, both of these are clearly visible. You can see fire, you can see mold. When asbestos is disturbed, you're not going to see those fine fibres. You're not going to see the damage that could potentially do 30, 40 years down the line. And I suppose when we consider the fact that the Grenfell disaster was horrific and that people died in that disaster, that every 2 weeks in the UK, the same number of people die from historical asbestos exposure as died in Grenfell every 2 weeks. There's a great drive at the moment, quite rightly, in terms of retrofitting buildings with adequate fire rating materials. Clearly that needs to be done. But as we know, asbestos exposure has happened and continues to be a problem. And this is a problem because there is no threshold for mesothelioma risk. A statement back in 2009 in the High Court when a mesothelioma sufferer, Diane Warmall, was going through a conversation against her local borough council. The statement was made that mesothelioma can occur after a low level of asbestos exposure and that there is no threshold dose of asbestos below which there is no risk. What they're saying then, that for every exposure to asbestos, there is a small risk. And that any level above what is commonly found in the air is therefore considered a risk. So any levels above background, general outdoor environment are considered a risk. So therefore, on one hand, we have asbestos exposure in heavy industry historically that caused mesothelioma, but there's also a risk that low levels of exposure can also lead to mesothelioma as well. And you think, well, if that's the case, why in my sort of 20-year plus career have I come across these sorts of attitudes when it comes to asbestos? I've spoken to people and, they will think it's all a thing of the past. My granddad worked on that, when he was in the shipyard or whatever, those sorts of comments are made, along with the fact that, it was banned years ago. Yes, it was banned years ago. The most hazardous types, brown and blue asbestos, were banned back in 1985. White asbestos were banned back in 1999. About 20 plus years of the ban, but it's still present in many, many buildings. Quite often you get the comment that that's the safe type. There's no safe type of asbestos. All types of asbestos fibre can cause asbestos diseases. And again, this kind of concept that you only get ill when you're old. Yeah, we understand that it takes 30, 40 years for these conditions to develop. But there are people today suffering with mesothelioma in their 30s and 40s. And they would have been exposed in the 1990s, maybe in the 2000s. Clearly, now there's something there that suggests that we need to be doing more. And then the drive to get surveys done to identify asbestos. Post 2002, in the requirement for the duty to manage that came in. There's a big rush to get surveys done of buildings to identify asbestos. And many organisations and companies would have thought they met the requirements, but the requirements are to manage asbestos, which clearly may not be being done to the best of our abilities. So when it comes to asbestos, and what is the size of the problem? I suppose the answer really to this is that I don't think anybody really knows. There's estimates from the HSE that there's around about 300,000 non-domestic properties that contain asbestos. And that comes from figures that they've issued through the Land Registry. And they assume that buildings are replaced at 1% per year. So you get these figures where over time, there's a reduction in the number of buildings that contain asbestos. And that's where these figures come from. Other estimates put the number of properties, when you include domestic properties, at around about 1.5 million buildings that contain asbestos. The true answer is that nobody really knows. But there are a lot of buildings out there. We did import significant amounts of asbestos into the country, and therefore a lot of that is still present. Now, the HSE's, the PIR, which is the post-implementation review of the regulations that was issued back in 2022, confirmed that 80% of public buildings contain asbestos. So already we're building a picture of there being asbestos present, through many, many buildings. And again, there's lower estimates for private buildings as well. The answer is we just don't know. So in terms of, recent documents and reports, 2022 saw 3 reports issued around asbestos. You wait for many, many years for things to happen in the asbestos sort of world, and like buses, they come along all at once. So we start off back in March of last year. In fact, in 2021, the UK Government Work and Pensions Committee looked into the effectiveness of the HSC's approach to asbestos management. And they reported back in March 2022. So this cross-party committee looked at how effective the HSC was at managing asbestos risk. And they gathered evidence from the asbestos industry, from business, from trade organisations, etc., and came up with various recommendations. And we'll look at those shortly. But to kind of paraphrase this report, it kind of painted a picture that asbestos management in the UK was all okay, and that everything was fine, and there was no real problem. So this kind of sort of drew alarm bells with the asbestos testing trade organisation, because from our experience, anecdotally, we hear every week or frequently of occasions when asbestos has been damaged or something's happened on site, and we're called out for an emergency air test or something like that. So clearly, this wasn't kind of sitting kind of comfortable with our experience day to day. So ATAC then commissioned the first report into asbestos in UK buildings. Again, there's some interesting figures that we'll go through on that as well shortly. Then finally, at the end of the year, in December, there was the second asbestos post-implementation review that was completed. Now, this is basically a review of the asbestos regulations to see if they're fit for purpose, and and that they're achieving their intended aims, i.e., reducing exposure and risk within the population. And again, we'll touch on that shortly. So looking at the government inquiry then, so the Work and Pensions Committee gathered evidence and produced a report on how effective the HSE is at managing asbestos risk. And it came up with about 10 recommendations, of which most were rejected by the government, stroke HSE. The first recommendation was a plan to achieve the removal of asbestos within 40 years, starting off with the most hazardous and high-risk types of material. This was rejected on the account that removing asbestos obviously is a risk, and therefore, if you were removing asbestos in a sound condition, you were increasing the risk of those contractors who remove asbestos. That's been kind of bandied about by the HSE for many, many years now. When I first started my career, 20 plus years ago, that was standard practice. But unfortunately, I think what we find is that buildings are now 20 years older, 30 years older, and the materials inside them are not getting any better in terms of their condition. So things are, I'm afraid, are only going to get worse over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So what are we going to do about it? We're going to wait another 40 years and issue another report? Let's wait and see. There was a call for a national asbestos register, particularly in the public sector. Nobody knows the extent of the problem, and that is probably part of the issue. So there was a call to set up a register. Again, that was rejected on account that mainly of cost and it being too cumbersome to pull together. That said, there is a private sort of community register being put together by UKNR, which is the UK National Asbestos Register, and they're quite heavily involved in the public sector trying to host asbestos information. There was quite a fair bit of criticism of the HSE in the government inquiry around its kind of research, in particular, sort of a lack of research on how we can improve removal. Should we be reducing the exposure limits for those who work with asbestos? And should we be doing more research into the exposure of asbestos within buildings that contain asbestos? A lot of research in the past from the HSE has covered asbestos exposure during asbestos works or asbestos contractors' work. But very little has been done to kind of look at the actual exposure levels within buildings that contain asbestos. So clearly, that's something that could be looked at, and the HSE are starting to look into potential research projects there. And then the other piece around the HSE was all around its kind of enforcement and training. So again, HSE, was encouraged to strengthen its guidance to duty holders. Those people have a legal responsibility to manage asbestos risk. Quite often, that duty holder role is a kind of tick in the box kind of exercise, which is not going to be good enough to ensure that the buildings are kept safe and people are kept safe. And finally, HSE to increase its inspection and enforcement activity, which always makes you chuckle because the government reduced the funding to the HSE, so they need to go out and actually make money to actually do their work. So unless you put money in, then how are you going to increase your inspection and enforcement activity? Far too many organisations seem to get away with poor standards when it comes to asbestos management. So there's this picture then painted by the Government Work and Pensions Committee that things could be better. So NORAC and ATAC then went on to collect data. So ATAC is the trade association for asbestos testing organisations, and a lot of these organisations obviously hold a lot of data in terms of asbestos information. 20-odd consortia submitted data that was anonymised and details taken out of buildings and client names, etc. And they collected data for over a 6-month period, had over 1 million lines of data, and came up with the following stats. So of all the buildings that were submitted, 78% contained asbestos. So we have 100,000 buildings containing asbestos that were submitted. In those buildings, there were around about 700,000 items of asbestos. And then of those 700,000 items, again, 71% had some level of damage. Now, admittedly, some of that damage may well have been, low damage, but again, a high percentage showed it being damaged. And of those damaged materials, again, 24%, 120,000 items would be deemed licensable. So we talk about the higher risk types of material, asbestos insulating board, pipe laggings, maybe spray coating. Even we go dial down into the figures further, when it comes to the high damage items, there were 25,000 high damage items, of which 19,000 were considered to be licensable work. Bearing in mind that HSE issues around about 35,000 licensed jobs a year, there's clearly a lot of work still to be done. And this snapshot is of organisations who are attempting to manage asbestos already. What we don't have is any visibility on those organisations who don't manage asbestos, who didn't get a survey done in those 6 months period. That problem is surely going to be a lot bigger than the issues or the figures that are shown here. We then move on to the HSE's post-implementation reviews. Again, like I say, this is a state of the nation report to look at whether the regulations are working in terms of the asbestos regulations. And again, this confirmed that about 80% of public buildings contain asbestos. And it concluded that the best way to reduce asbestos exposure or control asbestos risk is by the HSE, its intervention by this set of regulations, by the control of asbestos regs. And therefore, at this point in time, it was not necessary to amend the regulations. As part of the post-implementation review involves a cost-benefit analysis. And this confirmed that the regulations were achieving their objectives and that they remain valid. And in terms of sort of values, they put values on the costs and the benefits. And the estimate is a 16.3 billion net value benefit of the regs being in place. So when we talk about benefits, we're really talking about reductions in ill health and reductions of asbestos deaths in the future. And again, without any asbestos regulation, this document estimates there could be an additional 50,000 asbestos deaths over the next 100 years. So basically what we're saying is if we had no asbestos regulations, we'd have 500 people every year, shall we say, over the next 100 years, dying of asbestos diseases because of low level of exposures by being in buildings that contain asbestos or by disturbing asbestos. And when it comes to putting costs on a life, they've done this in the cost benefit analysis, and for every mesothelioma death, they estimate the cost to be 1.27 million in terms of the cost to society. That equates to around about £63 billion. So clearly, getting asbestos management right, although it is a costly process, has greater benefits in the long run. So with all this kind of reports coming out, and the HSE and the government seeming to think that asbestos management is in a good position, you don't need to look far to find reports in the press of buildings being in a poor state, and in particular our school estate. This report from The Guardian earlier this year stated that there were real concerns from the Royal Institute of British Architects that schools may collapse. And clearly these schools are going to be older buildings, primarily built in the 50s and 60s, and therefore prime candidates to contain asbestos. And therefore these buildings are certainly at higher risk of releasing fibres. If they're in a poor condition now and asbestos is still present, then the risk to the occupants is clearly going to be higher. And then again, looking further through the press, online, easy to find several examples of exposures or incidents in schools where asbestos has been disturbed or has been discovered. Now, we all work in buildings. We all go to work. We may have asbestos in the buildings we work in, but we're not likely to be kind of climbing on tables, kicking footballs around, generally larking around and messing about and causing damage to buildings. So clearly, schools are going to be a high risk area in terms of asbestos management. And I think really we've got to ask ourselves, as a first world country, should we have schools that still contain asbestos in the 2020s? And clearly, in terms of asbestos management, Regulation 4, the duty to manage, has failed. And if there's refurbishment works, and then Regulation 5 has failed as well. So clearly, the big concern about asbestos in schools. But there are challenges for all of us going forward as well. As we approach, the drive for net zero, there's going to be future challenges in terms of how we as a country, improve our building stock in terms of energy efficiency. And again, going back to the HSE's post-implementation review, they estimate that over the next 100 years, we will demolish all our buildings that contain asbestos. Now, this is just an estimate. But clearly, there's going to be a lot of work on buildings in the next 10, 20 years as we drive towards net zero. Clearly, this is a key opportunity to also get rid of our asbestos issues as well. What we don't want to be doing is increasing the risk of exposure to individuals in the drive for net zero by upgrading properties and disturbing asbestos. I mean, and even in this day and age, the HSE being underfunded, etc., there are still, fines out there in terms of non-compliance with asbestos regulations. And it's good to see, organisations being taken to court for not meeting the requirements of the asbestos regulations. And a recent fine for Poundland there, hundreds of thousands of pounds, £565,000, and in the words of the judge, for completely disregarding their duty to manage asbestos risk. And clearly, that is one extreme. That shouldn't happen. And then when we look at the NHS, the Office of National Statistics confirmed there were 177 mesothelioma deaths for those 3 years of NHS staff. Again, these staff were not working with asbestos. They were not installing asbestos or removing asbestos. They were working in our hospitals. So again, clearly, there's a risk there. And again, there's been many successful claims against the NHS for negligence in terms of asbestos risk. And the HSE's own figures also confirm that if you're a teacher or a nurse, you're about 5 times and 3 times respectively, more likely to contract mesothelioma than the population that's not exposed to asbestos. So what we're saying here then, or what the HSE is saying, is that there's a greater risk for people working in hospitals and schools, and that is primarily because they contain asbestos. There's one final kind of threat to the asbestos regulations. There's this wonderful piece of legislation going through Parliament at the moment called the Retained EU Law, otherwise known as the Brexit Bill. And this basically has a clause that by the end of this year, we can get rid of all our health and safety regulation, all our environmental kind of rules and regulations, because we're trying to free ourselves from Europe. There was an amendment seeking for the asbestos regs to be excluded from the sunset clause, but that was not taken up. And generally, the government response to this is that the HSE kind of owns the asbestos regulations, for want of a better word, and will continue to review its EU law to reduce business burden whilst maintaining high standards of health and safety. This is at a time when Europe is actively or proactively removing asbestos, is setting realistic timeframes to remove asbestos, and is considering lowering their exposure limits as well to asbestos by a factor of 10. So very shortly, we'll be out of step with Europe in terms of best practice going forward. With regard to this Brexit bill, it's likely not to go through this year. I think the general consensus that because of the kind of revolt in the House of Lords and extensive opposition from business and health and safety organisations and trade unions, it's likely that this will get kicked down the road for a few years whilst the various departments put in suitable regulations as fit for purpose. So I appreciate that's been quite a lot of kind of bad news. There is some good news. The HSE has launched a new asbestos awareness campaign, driven mainly at the trades, your plumbers and your electricians, etc. And again, if you manage staff who undertake work in buildings, visiting the HSE's website and looking for the Asbestos in You campaign is certainly worth a look. It's a very positive step from the HSE to improve awareness of asbestos risk. And later this year, they will also be issuing some further guidance for the duty to manage. And there's going to be another campaign to help inform those who have a duty to manage asbestos in terms of duty holders within organisations. So just leave you with this photograph. I appreciate you haven't seen many photos of asbestos today, but here's one. Just tune into this. So we have a ceiling here, light fittings. This is a school. You can see that these upstands here are the asbestos insulating board. And for some reason, don't know why, they've got it drilled through so that the light fitting now fits. Regulation 4, duty to manage. Regulation 5, refurbishment of the lights. Again, failure and failure. This was in a school that thankfully was about to be demolished, but clearly, that was occupied for a long time with those lights in that condition, in that AIB being drilled. Clearly, that is not managing asbestos. So just to wrap up, then, are we doing enough? Like I say, I've been in the industry 20 plus years. Did I think I'd still be in it 20 years ago? Maybe, maybe not. Again, key takeaways: asbestos is still a problem. It's still in buildings. It is a risk. There's going to be a potential high risk of ongoing exposure for the next few decades with the drive for net zero if we do not manage asbestos correctly. It can be managed correctly. We need to do that. And again, remember, the duty to manage is the duty to manage the asbestos risk. Closing a door on a problem and forgetting about it for 5-10 years is not managing the risk, because at some point somebody will go in there and potentially be exposed. And again, as a country, as organisations, should we be thinking of short to medium term plans to remove our highest risk materials? They're not going to get any better. We need to make sure that we're not going to be disturbing these materials. If they're if they're highly damaged, then really they should be getting removed as a matter of urgency. And really we should start with our colleges, our schools, our colleges, our universities, move on to hospitals. So the government does need to consider where it puts its resources over the next 5-10 years in terms of improving the public buildings that our children go to, and that we obviously use in terms of hospitals. So I hope you found that useful. Apologies again for the delay to the webinar. I'm now happy for you to turn on your microphones and ask any questions. or if you wish, you can add questions to the Q&A. Okay, well, thanks for your time, everybody. If you have any other questions you want to ask offline, well, email me. And like I say, thank you for I've just got a question here through from Stephen on, do you think UK should follow the EU and reduce the control limit to 0.01? That is a very, very good question, Stephen. The problem we have in the UK is that our techniques for air monitoring make it difficult as we get down to lower levels of detection. Now, over in Europe, they use SEM and TEM, which actually identifies asbestos fibres. But here in the UK, our techniques are a total fibre count. So we potentially would also include, non-asbestos fibres. But I do feel that it's probably the way we should be going. We should be improving things, and a reduction down to 0.01 will be a step in the right direction. I hope that's answered that question. Another question here. Do you feel the asbestos regulations will actually be disregarded through the Brexit bill? Personally, I don't think they will. I think there's a lot of health and safety legislation out there that's at risk under this Brexit bill. And I think reading between the lines, I don't think that's going to happen. There's going to be a lot of pressure on government departments to come up with replacement legislation. You just can't bin 50 plus health and safety legislation and regulations overnight. So I think that what will happen is that they will kick it into long grass for 2 or 3 years, and we'll take it from there. Okay, so for no other questions coming through, like I say, happy for you to email me at a later date or to contact other members of the team. Again, thank you for your time today. I hope you found that useful, and enjoy the rest of your day. Okay, bye for now.